people who know how to extract the most out of these systems with the least friction, who can get to those good outcomes, those are the people that are going to survive, right? And it doesn't really matter if I'm called a designer, if I'm called a PM, or if I'm called an engineer.
Okay, it is apparently recording.
I can see a big red flashing indicator, so we're good.
Okay, right. Well, let's start with where do you work, Hamza? Tell us about your company.
Yeah, hi, my name is Hamza. I'm a designer at Tessl. We describe Tessl as like a control plane for how organizations use AI agents. So if you think about most teams right now, they're probably using AI in some kind of ad hoc way where, you're copying prompts around, maybe you've created some skills, but you're probably sharing them over Slack. There's little to no versioning of any of these things, and it's kind of hard to know what's working, what's not working, who's owning some of these things and not owning some of these things. And so we're trying to help bring some structure to that, to organizations, right? So a way to package, to measure, and trust these skills, context that power these agents. So maybe in a more kind of concrete world, think of it like NPM, but with some of that governance and evaluation and observability built in. Alongside that, I'm also a visiting tutor at the Royal College of Art, where I coach second-year master's students in design and AI, which probably gives me maybe a different spin on how some of this space is evolving.
Yeah, amazing. Can we just spend a little bit of time on the Tessl piece? What's the pain point you're trying to address, and who has that pain point? Just so we
can good question. So I think the biggest pain point that we're looking at is all the things that I'm using actually making my agents better and more effective in producing those outcomes and results. So
what's a good example?
So let's say if I'm a developer who wants to code the next feature, often one of the things that I run into are things like the side effects of vibe coding. I maybe get hallucinated code that's referencing documentation that doesn't exist anymore, or maybe has changed because the package I was using has updated. Maybe it's missing some context around my business, and maybe it's completely ignored, things like the components that I may have created in the past, and it's just inventing new ones, and it's just adding code spaghetti, or it's, maybe missing some of that standards that you might have as an organization in terms of how you define what good engineering looks like. And so what we help you do is understand, actually, are these skills or context or rules or docs that you've created actually making a difference, or are they just bloating your window and just making you eat up more tokens and pay more for your AI than you need to? Could you be using a cheaper model to achieve the same or similar outcomes? And so maybe there's an efficiency gain here. So that's the kind of bucket of problems we're trying to help organizations do. And that's like at a developer level. But of course, when I'm an organization and I have 50,000 developers, it's like, well, how am I then performing across the organization, right? So the standard AI challenges that we've had in the past was like, well, I'm investing a lot of money in this AI, I'm investing a lot in these models and agents. Are they actually making a difference to my organization? Where are they contributing? Where they're not contributing? How can I, be more strategic about my investments?
Yeah, interesting. So I guess on the one hand, it's good old-fashioned engineering best practices, and trying to apply that to the agents that a lot of these institutions are now frequently using to do these tasks and to execute code for them. And then I guess the model piece, which I hadn't really thought about, but I guess can you spend less to achieve the same, but just by improving the standards that sits around it, which I think is fascinating, because that applies to people as well, doesn't it?
It does, and actually, so some of the work that we've done around our evals work has actually shown us that you can. So for many cases, what you could do is a well-written, well-structured skill with a maybe cheaper model can actually give you just as good outcomes as a model that is high performing but costs you more, right? So actually what it does is gives you sufficient guardrails to be able to leverage that tooling, and therefore reduce your operating costs as an organization.
Yeah, got it. And where does Tessl fit into kind of this now broad infrastructure that is emerging to support agents generally? So you've got your model providers like Claude, and then you've got this broad emerging concepts around best practice skills that can be made available within a code base. Like, where does Tessl fit into
So I would think of it as like your ability to manage that layer, right, of skills and context. So we sit above the model, but probably before your agent, if that makes sense. So you as a user are interacting with your agent, we kick in and say, well, did you load this skill because, maybe a user has activated a certain keyword. So for example, I want to do this change in front end, or actually I want to rewrite my docs. And so it should, reference these skills, etc. And so we probably sit in that middle layer of that stack, and you can then use that as a distribution mechanism.
Yeah, I guess because what's fascinating about that is that the skills really could, it becomes quite multi-dimensional, doesn't it? You could give an agent access to a design system and suddenly start designing things similar.
Yeah.
But then it also goes to, well, how do we handle things like versioning and the language you use within code, and I'd say all these sorts of, there's just a lot to it, I guess. That isn't
and right
just
now we've only talked about dev-focused skills, right? We've not even talked about non-engineering workflows. So,
interesting. Okay, double click on that very quick.
So like I'm a designer, right? And so I'm usually at the intersection of things like marketing, but also engineering. So, we have a tone of voice or a brand that we want to represent. And so how do we make sure that translates into the product copy or the UI or maybe in the documentation? Right? And that's, at a higher level, they feel like two distinct things, right? Because you're saying, well, that's marketing and that's in its own world, and they have certain rules that they want to follow. And it's often things like maybe voice, visual style, your communication style. You want to be fun or punchy or serious and like, very stiff because of enterprisey and security and all those things. But then that should translate into your product UI, right? So the way you give instructions or the way you provide error feedback or where you do these things. And so actually, this allows us to connect a lot of those bridges together, because now I can encode some of that into a skill if I wanted to, as part of my design system, let's say. And now actually that's available. So even if someone is kind of, creating a new feature and those things, hopefully you can embed a lot of your organizational standards into this directly and have that comfort that, it's going to be picked up.
Organizational standards. Yeah, I love it. Love it. That sounds like principles. And so Hamza, talk a little bit about your role at Tessl. So you're a designer.
Yeah, so I'm leading leading the design team here at Tessl, and right now I think a big part of my role is shaping how the product comes together end to end, right? So it's not just about refining and designing those interfaces, but also thinking about the core concepts, the primitives, and how we actually use those in practice. Because the context engineering space is still relatively new. A lot of the patterns aren't established. Many of the workflows are still emerging. And as a result, I think a lot of those implications aren't obvious to anyone, right? We can all crystal gaze at some of this thing, but we'll see over time how that's going to manifest. So a lot of it's around creating that structure, figuring out actually, what is a skill in itself? What does it actually mean for organizations? How do they behave? How do you evaluate them? How do they even fit into that developer workflow? Or as we were talking about, non-developer workflows. So, coming back to maybe more of a concrete example here, like, when a developer is thinking about installing a skill to use with their agent, is it actually going to make a difference? Is it going to make my agent better? Am I going to have to just rework the stuff that, it spits out? And so thinking of ways to answer that cleanly, right? So thinking about things like evaluation scores, thinking about things like version history and visibility into how it performs across those different models. Because otherwise it's all about, that black box problem, right? You're asking them to trust this thing and they don't really know.
These are all new patterns as well, aren't they? They're kind of like new patterns for this entirely new paradigm around agents and how they might work within an organization. And just from a design perspective, you're having to think about stuff that's never been done before.
Done before, right? So it's a lot about taking those abstract things and concepts and making them tangible. And I think good design has great power in that, right? And giving people the ability to use that with confidence and figuring out like, okay, if I use this thing, I'm not going to completely nuke my code base, or I'm not going to suddenly delete prod by doing any of these things. So defining new patterns for a new space, turning those abstract AI concepts into something hopefully developers can trust and actually use.
Yeah, so cool. And what I love about this is that I guess the whole point of these conversations is about getting perspectives from people that are not just at the cutting edge, but are actively building to understand what this future looks like with AI, with agents, things like that, because it gives them a first-hand or a first row seat to how their own role is going to change. I think you've already touched on a few points there around context engineering and what that means for design and non-engineers. But how do you see AI? And of course, when I'm saying AI, I'm talking about LLMs and agents and this new flavor of AI rather than the machine learning of a decade ago. But how do you see that changing your role as a designer?
First of all, I think more than anything else, it's a fun playground, right? And I think it's I don't think I've ever had as much fun building as I've had in the past at any given point in time. So it just gives you lots of new opportunities. And so thinking about like how my job may have changed or evolved, right? There's probably three layers to this. For me as an individual, I think the biggest shift definitely has been speed and judgment and fun. I can actually raise my ambition quite significantly because of all of this. I can explore more of the design space. I can test ideas much faster than before. I mean, personally, I was always quite comfortable getting into code and opening PRs, but that used to be the exception. Now it's becoming more and more of the norm.
And is that when you talk about exploration and going further with that exploration, is that what you mean? Do you mean taking your designs and building them and then seeing how they perform and being able to get feedback on them? Is that
so I'd say across 2 dimensions, right? So you can start off wider earlier as well. So maybe before I would have had time to do like 3 concepts, maybe I can now do 6 or 7. So I can explore that wider. And then once I feel confident in maybe 2 or 3 of those directions, then you can go deeper in them as well.
Yeah.
So it's across both axes here, that I would say.
And this is probably a simplistic. What are you using? Like what's enabling you to be able to do that?
So I'm using right now probably a combination of Figma. So I still do use Figma a bit, especially for like high, like bespoke visualizations and those types of stuff. So Figma, sketching and those things. And then a combination of Cursor and Claude Code.
Interesting. And why the combination of the two? Like, is that a preference thing or?
Yeah, it's more of a preference thing because I would say with Cursor, just having an IDE open and being able to use it and just doing that. Also, because like I said, I was comfortable using like VS Code in the past and opening PRs and stuff. So for me, that feels like a natural evolution. And then just connecting that to Claude Code, just because I think the outcomes tend to be a lot better for the work that I'm doing. So when you combine like Figma's MCP with Claude Code, at the moment, it feels like that stack works quite well. I mean, you still have a few issues here and there, but in general, 80-90% of the way gets you quite close. Yeah. And I think when you're really prototyping,
have to put a little label up in the corner here to say what the date was, because all of these tools will be completely different in a week's time.
Yeah.
And even Cursor's just been acquired by SpaceX or something, hasn't it? So that's who knows what that'll look like in a month.
And then I actually use ChatGPT for a lot of image generation, which maybe is surprising for people because I'm not using like Midjourney instead.
Okay.
Because I find actually once you give ChatGPT guardrails, it's actually much better at giving you more consistent images, at least in my use cases.
Gosh, I mean, it's just reinforcing everything you just said about Tessl and the context engineering piece and what the instructions, the quality of the instructions you give. So just, I mean, it's difficult to reflect on this at this point. It's moving so quickly. But if you were a new designer, if you were getting into design for the first time today, and maybe actually, can we go back to what you were talking about in terms of your lecturing, and maybe you can reflect on some of that. But what is the advice you're giving to people that are just getting into design or they're figuring out what AI means for them? Like, what's your advice, right?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think there are probably a couple of faults here, right? So I think when I look at those people kind of early in their career, the shift that I'm seeing in terms of their mindset and attitude, and that's not to say it's not the case elsewhere or it hasn't been in the past, but maybe a greater emphasis on like outcomes and exploration, right? So with my students, I think they're less attached to specific roles and titles. And they're more, they're not thinking in disciplines in the way perhaps I would have done when I was a student. They're thinking more about like, I've got this problem to solve. What are the tools that can help me get there? And AI can really, really amplify that. And again, it helps them explore more of those surface areas and helps them think about, what are the different things they can try, because they don't, in there, they don't have a pre-world, right? Like we do.
Yeah.
So they don't know what the before and after is. For them, it's just the after.
Yeah, it's so interesting that I can remember coming up in building software and advertising and going into project management. Yeah, 2 years in, the idea that I would have been able to become an engineer or a designer. No, you're a project manager now.
Yeah.
That's what you do. I love that frame, that actually it's less about the role and the title. It's more about the outcome and feeling empowered to get there, regardless of discipline.
But probably, I think the two caveats that I would then, because you were asking like what advice I would also give them, that the first is, do not let these tools rob you of your critical thinking. That's probably the biggest one, right? Because you don't want these students who are kind of early in their career just taking those things verbatim and then not applying their judgment or their kind of level of understanding, or not, interrogating the outputs in the way that they perhaps should be. And I think that's probably where they lack a little bit, right? They don't have an experience to base some judgment off of. And so that's typically my biggest thing is like, interrogate it, try and understand the why behind it and all those things. Yes, because it gives you a lot of these things, but it also gives you lots of noise. And so you really want to think about, why are you saying yes to something? And you should be saying no to lots of things as well, but understanding why that's the case. Whereas I think if you're a bit later in your career, like us, right, we have that experience to base judgment off of. And so for us, maybe execution gets faster and we can maybe automate some stuff. And maybe, we should definitely be automating a lot of stuff, but knowing what to build, what to trust, what to ignore, I think becomes the bigger problem. And I think that's where the experience compounds, right? Because if I do have 55 prototypes, I have to say no to the 54 as well, right? And I have to know why I'm saying no to those.
Yeah, and so I guess, especially from a design perspective, there's a degree of subjectivity.
Exactly.
What does good look like to every designer? It looks slightly different. What does good look like to every engineer, I guess?
And also users, right? Because if you're giving users more variety, then by nature, many of them are going to level out, because they're going to say, well, some of them are going to say, well, I like this one. The others are going to say, I like this one. And then suddenly you're like, well, we've got an equal split. What do we do? Right?
Well, I don't about it like that. Right? But you're right. You give everyone an unlimited amount of options. You're going to end up with something beige, aren't you?
So you've got now you've got choice paralysis. All right. Yeah. Because before we used to use, user testing as an external way of breaking maybe internal deadlocks.
Interesting.
So,
okay.
So how do you now do that, right? Because now you can give users infinite options.
Yeah.
And and everyone feels like they have good taste and all those things. And so how do you kind of start showing the good from the great and these things, right? So it's an interesting dynamic, and I think we still don't know what the implications are, and I'm quite curious to see how things go.
Yeah, but I mean, on the front line, both in the way that people are being educated and the way it's being built. So it's a lucky position to be in. Yeah. All right. So the big question. What is your prediction for the future? Obviously, there's a lot of people on LinkedIn and networks, from big consultancies all the way down to solo influencers making big statements about which discipline is dead. That this one's over and all these sorts of things, but you're on the front line. What do you think will be true in a year's time in terms of the way we work and the way we build products?
Yeah, I think if I kind of stick to that theme of like, early versus later in your career, I think the future of work is maybe less about specific roles and more about leverage, right? And it always used to be as well, but I think this just gets amplified even more, right? So people who know how to extract the most out of these systems with the least friction, who can get to those good outcomes, those are the people that are going to survive, right? And it doesn't really matter if I'm called a designer, if I'm called a PM, or if I'm called an engineer. I think the product trio, in the way we classically split it in the past, probably doesn't exist. But I do think, when I think
about the product trio, you mean design, engineering, product. Yeah, okay.
Right? I think maybe that doesn't exist, right? So when I think about how even I collaborate at a team level, thanks to AI, the boundaries have become incredibly less rigid, right? Designers have become much closer to implementation. The engineers I work with have become even more involved in shaping product behavior. Maybe as a tangible example, like I used to hand over Figma files, now I'm handing over PRs, right? And so we're still trying to figure out what that means, right? Should I just be doing dummy front end, or should I also be including database connections and like pure backend work? Maybe that's a bit too much.
comes back to the outcome, doesn't it?
Right, but it comes back down to outcomes, right? If I'm someone in an organization who's trusted to say, well, we're noticing problem X in our product, go solve it. Does it really matter if I stop arbitrarily at Figma or, here's a release candidate ready for people to test? I don't think so.
No.
Right. And so I think that's where it comes, right? So you get, we had ownership of outcomes before, but they were perhaps cleanly defined to roles. Now it's going to be defined to individuals based on whether it's their preference, maybe their, affinities to different types of tooling, or maybe, certain types of problems, etc. But I think that's where we'd end up.
So you see the lines blurring, and the rigid design of product teams in the past also changing to be potentially more fluid. But I guess your point earlier about craft and taste still matter.
Of course.
So, an individual that does take it end to end is probably going to need to have some experience across all of those disciplines to be able to do that, right?
Yeah.
So then does it get reduced down to that question of expertise? Like, do you end up partnering with someone that has their 10,000 hours in, and figure out what a good design looks like if you've never touched a design before? How do you see that working?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because I guess the design world, in my opinion, has already faced that, right? Because you used to have, visual design, user researcher, and, UX designer were three separate roles, right? Over time, they collapsed into the product design role because the tooling improved, the way we worked changed, and all those things. So that was like maybe one level of collapse. Now we're seeing it happen in a more kind of cross-functional way, right? And I think it's more about you as individuals. What spikes you have, and what do you care about, and what kind of professional you want to be. And as a result of that, you might then gravitate towards different people that you collaborate with, because I really like James because he's got an incredible way of writing, and so I want to leverage his toolkit in terms of microcopy and those things. But maybe there's someone else is like, oh, they're a brilliant engineer and they're able to really collapse complexity into a simple architecture that we can deploy quickly, right? And so yes, people will still have their own backgrounds that they leverage on, but that doesn't mean they won't be able to tiptoe in other places.
I love that. I think that's a great prediction. And it's really interesting they brought up that product design example, because you're right. This idea that specific individuals would be responsible for specific skills has already started to collapse in lots of areas. Collapse is the wrong word. I think it's become democratized in the sense that anyone can have a spike in multiple different skills. Does it matter if 2 of those skills are in design and 3 of them are engineering and 2 of them are in product? Who cares?
Well, yeah, especially if I'm a business with an outcome. Like, does it really matter? If so-and-so calls themselves this, but at the end of the day, they managed to achieve what we need, right? That's probably enough. I don't know what that means in terms of like progressions and like standardization and those things, and how do you shift from one company to another and how you articulate yourself. But in the creator economy, right, like there's a whole thing about self-branding and those things. And maybe parts of that then start eking over into the tech world, and you're like, well, I'm so-and-so who's good at this. And so maybe we're kind of all, and contractors have had to do that all the time as well. So it's not, I don't think these are new things per se, but it just means more people are probably, impacted by it as a result. And so they have to figure out, how do they fit into this jigsaw puzzle? And I'm not claiming I know the answer to that for myself, right? I'm still trying to figure out, how do I, who am I, Hamza, as a designer? Like, do I still lead with that as a title? Like, hi, I'm Hamza, I'm a designer, or, hi, I'm Hamza, the product person, but that feels a bit weird.
To be honest, even in institutions where those lines are beginning to blur, we used to default to product builder, right? Builders has become a generic term, I guess, for people that do more than one thing. I'm now concerned, Hamza, that might be the most serious prediction we get. I suspect it's downhill from there.
Probably it is. Everyone else is saying like, we're going to all wear hats and they like rotate around, and then with the hat, depending on what axes is on, now you're going to be a PM, then you're going to be an engineer, then you're going to be a designer, and it might just
like
have
a real-time sorting hat. Yeah. Nice. Okay, let's we'll do both predictions and see which one comes true. That's awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dude, for sharing your experience. I think it will be incredibly valuable to a lot of people, and we'll connect again in a year's time. See whether it came true.
Well, if you bring me a hat, I'll know which one of those came true.